Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to this panel with us. So I am going to jump right in and ask Stan all the most obnoxious questions here. Looking forward to it.
We're already off script, just like that.
So Stanley, right now, Vice President of the ESA. What does that mean? Like, from a gaming standpoint, as a consumer, I know that that's E3 and so on and so forth, but what are your actual duties?
Well, first of all, it's great to be at GamesBeat, and Dean does a terrific job in this, so it's exciting to be here and with all of you and to talk about something that's really important to me and to all of us. Our job as a trade association is really to serve as the voice and advocate for each of you, right, for industry, to ensure that our voice is being heard, that we're creating a great marketplace for games to get made, for innovation to occur, and really to increase public awareness and trust in the things that we do as an industry. So we find that to be exciting. We collaborate with other groups. We make sure that we're meeting with public officials, with office holders, with regulators, and then we partner with our international trade associations to ensure that we're aligned on a lot of the messaging that's important in what we do to make sure that our story gets told in a positive way.
Whoa, that's a lot of, that's a lot. The video game consumer base and the people who are making games, it's so complex, it's so diverse, there's so many different types of gamers. So what are some of the challenges to meet the needs of so many different types of people and organizations?
Well, you're right, and that diversity of geography, of types of games, all those things drive a really compelling story that we get to share. And the first thing we try to do is get those stories in and try to build a consensus about what's important to us as an overall mission. So many companies, if you just look at esports, every company has a different stake in what esports is and means and how they monetize, if they monetize. But how do we assemble a story that says this is part of the growth story of our industry? So we spend a lot of time trying to build consensus, to listen, and then to figure out what the highest level message is, and we try not to reduce it to its lowest common denominator. We want to tell a really positive, strong story about industry. You know, one example is right now there are lots of conversations about trade in Washington. And one of the things we do better than almost any other industry is export the great content that gets made here to other countries. So we have a trade surplus, unlike other industries. Like I think aerospace is up there with us, and some other media entities. But we have such a positive story to tell, and when we walk in and can say, here's what we do for trade, it opens up the conversation for lots of other things that are important to us and to get the ear of policymakers in Washington and in the States and in increasingly foreign capitals.
What are some of the unique challenges that you face in this industry, in this space? Like, you're trying to tell a positive story, but as you know, there are so many different factors that can affect that narrative. So what are some of those unique challenges that you overcome on a daily basis?
Sure, the number one thing is getting the message out. So that means talking to the largest possible community, you know, either through the press, mainstream press, a game press. It's talking to those office holders so that they hear specifics about us, and it's talking to our community to make sure that they understand that when you're either at a pep rally for a politician or a PTA meeting, you understand that 72% of parents, for example, really appreciate and use controls on their systems to limit how much time or money their kids are spending, right? Knowing those things helps in conversations about screen time or about paying money on systems. So we try to accumulate those facts, spread them out, and make sure people understand how we're really creating an ecosystem. If you think about what video games do, unlike any other media industry, we create the games, we often create the platforms, we create the parental controls around those, and then we help create community. We create a platform so communities can develop. And that's very unique from any other form of media, where we're able to create ecosystems that can then organically grow into systems that really sustain themselves.
All right, well, I mean, you just mentioned screen time.
Did I say that? Did I say screen time?
Yeah, you did mention that. So we are going to, you know, one of the major talking points that we have today is the World Health Organization and this concept of gaming disorder, and that potentially becoming a designation. Could you talk through some of the challenges of of having that as gaming disorder just being something that's a major diagnosis?
Sure, sure. Well, the first thing is when we hear World Health Organization, I think many of us have a positive thought about the work that they do, and that's what we have found in looking at what they do, whether it's working on Ebola, getting clean water places. Those are the traditional things that we think about with the World Health Organization. So one of the important things for us is not saying that, castigating the World Health Organization. Our main concern has been the focus on video games in this context, not on all screens, not on various devices. It's been on video games, and we've been concerned with that area of focus, and have actually had good conversations with them about it. And we learned a few things in those conversations. One is they recognize and now are really saying the overwhelming majority of people who play games and the use of games is positive and has a positive impact on people's lives. And so getting them to say that was a major, major step. The other is that what they're doing with this classification is not a diagnosis. And we've gotten them to clarify that they're not creating a diagnosis of game disorder, but rather a category. And that's been really important to people understand where the process is, because they're trying to collect data and do other things with that information. But some of the characterizations have been very negative. And so we've worked with them to see if they can tamp that down and axe it on the positive. Our biggest disagreement with them is really where the science is. Because if you look at medical journals, I'm not a doctor, I'm not going to pretend to be one. But if you look at where the American Psychological Association is, the American Psychiatric Association is, the American Medical Association, none of them agree with this finding. And so the science isn't there to support it. All that said, our number one concern is building up community, building up positive gameplay. So what we've been saying is, to the extent someone needs help, whether it's from something else that manifests itself into gameplay or otherwise, they should get the help that they need, and that should be available. We shouldn't stigmatize video games and video game play, particularly given all the positives that video games now do and that are being recognized. And as a side note, the UNICEF, right, the Children's Welfare Organization run out of the UN itself, also agrees that this should not be a category. When UNICEF looks at this, they say, whether you're talking about screen time or any of these other issues, it's the quality of the time spent, not how much time you spend. And you shouldn't stigmatize any kind of screen time, let alone video games. So we're finding that other independent agencies who are looking at this issue completely disagree with this. And what we're saying is, let's try to figure out some positive end games that we can get from this discussion.
I mean, and you're pretty passionate about this from a personal standpoint, because you, as a parent, you have a young son that also plays video games. So now that you're like immersed in this conversation, are you more sort of concerned with his screen time, or do you compartmentalize how he plays games, or limit the time that he has on screen, or, have a differentiation between like maybe video games or TV or phone time? Like, how do you personally navigate that?
Well, first and foremost, it's about communication and about having the conversations about what is going on and learning what's happening. If you don't know that flossing isn't only for your teeth, you aren't paying attention to your 12-year-old, right? You've got to know what they're doing and how they're doing it. Also, you try to create some boundaries that are realistic. Like there are parental controls you can use to limit time very specifically. And then there are, and we can talk about that in a moment, because I think that's a really critical piece of this. And we've had some really great discussions with people about parental controls. But really, it's communicating and understanding the back and forth. Certain rules like, no screens at the dinner table. What that means is no one gets screens at the dinner table. It's not like you get to check your email, but he can't continue his game in our case. Like, you've got to set boundaries, but that makes sense, particularly for a 12-year-old, for the way that they think. In terms of the parental controls I mentioned before, I think many people in this room are familiar with not only the work of the Entertainment Software Rating Board, but also of what the console manufacturers do and what more and more device manufacturers do, which is creating opportunities for parents and anyone to limit spending, screen time, and a very easy way to do it. And if you go to parentalcontrols.org, you'll get video clips of exactly how to do it on every single device. My favorite one right now is the Switch, because it comes on an app. So you can be remote and go, nope.
Nice.
Which I do for fun sometimes, but I don't anymore because I interrupted an important game once.
Ooh.
And that was not well received. So you've got to listen as well. But I think setting some parameters, but also give and take, and just listening to see what's developing.
All right. Well, for me personally, like building communities is so important. And in Chicago and in Chicago Public Schools, I not only educate kids on best practices and opportunities in the gaming space, but I have to educate their parents. And there's a lot of notions, misconceptions about the video game industry. Like you yourself, you've been in this deeply. Is there any suggestions that you can give a person like me and other people who work within communities of gamers as it pertains to screen time, as it pertains to like what suggestions can I give to parents from the experience that you yourself have had?
Well, I always start from the positive because there is so much to share about what video games mean. So for example, one stat that always surprises people is that young girls who play video games are 3 times as likely to get a STEM degree in college, right? So that changes what you think about video games. And then also to talk about what it means for creating grit, right? You've got to get to each level. Creating problem-solving skills, building communities. So a lot of people, when I talk to parents, for example, they'll say, they're on Fortnite, why are they doing that? And you say, well, Fortnite's not just a game, it's a community. It's the digital playground, right? So, and also what I've seen with my son is, he's not only playing those games, but because my skill sets are diminishing in certain card games. So I've had to learn Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, Dragon Ball Z, and now Magic the Gathering. Nice. That's just a lot to learn against someone who's spending all of his time there. So sometimes it's online play is against people on those online systems. So it's another extension of what you would do in the physical world. So it's understanding that there are a lot of positive attributes and capabilities. I think beyond that, it's knowing what the tools are available, understanding what the rating systems are. And by the way, the ESRB that I mentioned earlier, they have the most touted of all the media industries in terms of their rating system. The FTC on several occasions, Federal Trade Commission in Washington, has said they have the best and most robust of the systems in terms of how it's created and how it's enforced. Which means back in the day when people would go to a physical store to buy everything, you were more likely to get carded buying your video game than buying a movie or a disc for music. So the kind of training that goes into it and care, like we just stand above all other media. So I think part of it's also understanding that this is an industry that cares about its community, that listens to the community and tries to build on it. And everything is about listening and feeding into what the community wants.
So how do you listen? I know that sounds like an awkward question, but in these conversations, as we talk about, like, we have to listen to the community, what are the actionable items for that? Like, how do companies really lean into listening to the community and being a part of it in a very positive and healthy way?
Well, we heard David Haddad earlier just talk about the communities they build around many of their games, including the one that's going to come out in a time yet to be determined called Harry Potter. And they spend a lot of time hearing those reactions, and so there's a real-time basis there. But there are lots of other inputs. It's coming out to have conversations like this, and it's going to meetings and hearing. I've gotten, within ESA alone, I get emails from parents who are member company employees who say, hey, I was at a PTA meeting and someone said X, what should I say? And I can send them a link to something that ESRB is working on, or the Family Online, the FOSI? Family Online Safety Institute.
There you go.
So we're able to get them information about how do you have these dialogues. And I think that becomes empowering because now you start to view what your kid is doing in a different light, because it's not just spending time on a screen. It's actually developing other skills and communicating. And so we spend a lot of time listening and getting information out.
Nice. I mean, is it all about children, or is there a way that we can get more parents to become a part of this space in a proactive way? Because usually it's, all right, I'm gonna get my kid what they want, a console or a PC game, whatever, and then they're kind of not really a part of that. Is there a way to inspire parents as well to be a part of it in a way that is productive for them?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier communication. Part of that is engagement. So this is funny for me, not for my mother-in-law, but whenever she visits, my son sits her down and they play Madden together, and he just crushes her. He just tries to get to 100 as quickly as he can. But what we're seeing is more and more there's intergenerational play, and so it's really about families playing together. 56% of people in the US play games with other people, whether it's physically or online, and more of that community aspect's happening. And I think parents ought to figure out, well, what is happening in this game? I only play games at home that I can play with a 12-year-old, so that limits what I'm going to play at home, but it also means I can engage. I'm also, I've told Nintendo this a few times, they should thank me because I've had to buy multiple items of things, so 2 3DSs, 2 Switches, because and if I want to play the game, he loves it so much that we've got to play against each other using our own devices. So, making the investment of time to really engage on what's important to them and then learning what that means. Of course, he thinks he has no limits because Dad works in the video game business and therefore it's important. You say, no, we're not going to go there.
Well, I mean, that's awesome. And, there's so many things that you're doing. What's next? I mean, I know that you guys are crafting really positive narratives around what the video game industry is and how it can be beneficial. But what is the next big thing that the ESA will be working on?
Well, there are many things that we're doing, large and small, some that you hear about and some that we're still growing. One of the most exciting things we've been doing is working with the accessibility community to work and learn from what their needs are so that we can transmit that information to game developers and publishers so that more information is given about how to make video games accessible by design. You saw the incredible Super Bowl ad by Xbox for the Xbox Adaptive Controller, and that's just a wonderful moment for our industry to have a Super Bowl ad that talks about expanding community. That's just powerful. That's just super powerful.
That commercial ruined me yesterday. I got to speak to Gabby Michelle about that whole project, and they had the audacity to show the commercial right before it. And I'm just like, I got a frog in my throat. This is so difficult to do now. But yeah, an organization like that, the team that did build the Xbox Adaptive Controller, they really had some unique ways in which they immersed themselves in that community to get the answers and to get that narrative.
Yeah.
So, is there...
Yeah, you know what's interesting about that, by the way?
What?
So that project started off as a hackathon, right? Started off as a hack at Microsoft, and people came up with the project and they funded it, and then they kept going with it. We were really excited when the foundation that partners with us, ESA Foundation, honored them at a recent gala night to night and got to hear from the team who worked on it. And it's kind of incredible. You start off working on a hackathon and then it becomes this worldwide phenomenon. That's exciting. One thing I should mention, because we're about 7 weeks away, E3. That's going to be a massive, massive endeavor for us. That's our top priority coming up because it's going to be an amazing show. I've seen things in the papers all week about hints about what people think is happening in terms of announcements and all of that. I just can't wait for all those things to come out, but that's going to be the most exciting thing coming in the next few weeks.
I've been going to E3 off and on for the last 10 years, and it's definitely changed. So where is the new direction of E3 going? Because it's definitely, sort of changing its brand. It used to be, for media, and that's where you would go to get the first look at any new exciting game. Now it's not necessarily that. So could you expand more on what you guys, what E3 is going to be, and how it's going to be different from all these other gaming conferences?
Sure. Well, one of the great things about E3 is it's always been the loudest voice for industry to share their stories, whether it's making game announcements, making device announcements, or just telling a story. And that's going to be true again this year. It has this seismic ability to channel all the attention on the gaming world in a way that no other show does, which means that when companies come to E3, they really want to make sure they make the most use of that light being cast on what they're doing. And so what we're seeing is we've got to adapt E3 to the new reality that games come out all the time on various devices. How do you focus that? So we've been doing that by, for example, adding consumers, right? So the past few years, more and more consumers have been coming and getting to engage and talk about what they're seeing. You're seeing more and more influencers want to engage on E3 and talk about what they're seeing. And now there are a lot of other kinds of companies that aren't traditional game companies that want to help tell that story because everyone is seeing the value of the audience, the devices, the innovation. Everyone wants to know how you gamify everything, whether it's education, the workplace. I have 2 roles, workhorse, showhorse. And so in one of my roles when I'm dealing with some public officials, they were excited to introduce me to various companies that are now using VR for employee training. right? So everything is being gamified and using technologies that are either given birth to in our industry or being really expanded on in what we do and hitting on every facet of life. So I think E3 provides more opportunities for people, and therefore more people want in to get some of that light and help expand and amplify the message.
I mean, you touched on a good point about like how a lot of industries are sort of birthed from, a lot of products are birthed from the game industry, and that's not a conversation that's had, at least in my space, very often. Is there a way that we can amplify like what that really means? Because you know, we as humans, we intrinsically learn through play, we intrinsically learn through gaming, but somewhere down the line, there's many of us that stop thinking of gaming as a tool to learn and just start thinking of it as completely just entertainment. So is there a way to like cultivate better conversations around it and amplify the fact that gaming really does have so many intellectual merits?
Sure. Well, we definitely are trying to get the word out on that. Every year, for example, we put out essential facts about video games so that people have like the steady flow of statistics that really speak to that. I think it's also identifying what it is and calling it out when you're there in the moment. And I think people, they get it when you point it out, they don't when you don't, because people think initially, and even earlier, yesterday and today when some of the execs from the big companies were here, they're talking about wanting to delight, wanting to create, like the focus of the marketing is really on the games. What we try to do is also say there are all these other amazing benefits to how people learn. I talked about grit earlier, and I talked about problem solving. Those are all real things that people want. There are now articles by independent researchers saying more and more companies are looking for people who played video games as kids because they just like to solve the problem, right? And if you look at some of the big innovators, whether it's Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and others, they will tell you what brought them into their industries is playing video games as a kid. Because what they're doing is gamifying what they're excited about today. But it all started for them with video game play.
All right, and is there any like advice that you would, like going back a little bit, we were talking about the accessibility community and the unique ways that they have built a very authentic and productive, space and productive products. Is there anything that you see that other companies are not doing that they could take an example from the companies that are doing it well? Is there like something specific that you see that, man, if they only knew, if they talked to the community like this, or if they engaged with people in this way, this would solve many more problems?
I think the number one thing is the outreach. If you're not conducting the outreach, you don't hear what the community wants. And that's true of any community, of any audience. One of the great things about the video game industry is it's willing to disrupt its success to get ready for the next challenge. And your consumers, and when I say consumers, I just mean all your community members, are always telling you what they're interested in, and if you're willing to listen to it, you'll improve. And so there's a big concept now in privacy law called privacy by design. Don't build it and try to add privacy protections later on. Build it with it in mind. And that's every facet of what game companies are doing, is thinking about how do all of our communities want to access this tool, this data, the devices, everything, and how do we build that from the ground up as we try to expand community, because it's growing at an exponential rate because we're listening. And so I think that's the number one thing, is listen and do the outreach.
All right. I mean, and like for you personally, you come from a law background, correct?
I do.
So have you always been personally passionate about gaming, or how did you land in this space?
Well, it's been exciting for me as a journey. I grew up playing the early games of Atari and Intellivision, and it was a fun part of my life. And then I really came back to it with a kid and started playing those games. So I'm currently stuck in Undertale. So if anyone has some clues on how to get out of where I am in Undertale, that'd be very helpful. So I play what he plays, and then at work we try to play other games so I get more exposure to different games. But for me, it's been a culmination of working in music and film and television and bringing all those things into the video game space and seeing how it differentiates itself. And what I love about it is we are a dual DNA industry. You need all the skills that you have from innovation to be able to create special codes and write that code. And you also need to have that artistic ability to make it compelling. So that dual DNA means we need to think about not only the science and the craft, but the policy issues that affect our industry. And they're very unique. And they mean that we end up being a really good barometer for policymakers, because we've got to look at all the tensions that various industries bring in. and solve for them before we even figure out where we want to be. And because of that, I like to tell people there are many paths into video games. There's no one path. I would not have been a great coder, but I love lending my skill set to what we do. And by the way, video game companies I always say this to people, we are full-fledged companies. We do all the same things. So you need marketing people, you need PR people, you need HR people, you need real estate people. Like, you need all those things. There are many ways to engage, and just being in the industry just makes people feel really good about what they do, even if they're not creating the games.
So I take it you never get bored at your job.
Oh, no. There's always another challenge with respect to games, but there's always another connection to make. So I was with a group of chiefs of staff for these U.S. senators, and I told one of them that, we work together with these companies, and I mentioned one particular game, and he was excited because that was his favorite game, and it turns out that the senator for whom he works is interested in certain policy issues related to it, and in that case, it's Veterans Affairs, and it's a game that involves kind of war games. And that's exciting for him because there's a vet component that he can put into his life, and then that creates an opportunity to talk about other policy issues that we care about through the lens of something that his senator and he cares about passionately, and it's all through video games. And so you're getting to that point generationally where the people who are taking offices grew up playing games, and therefore they're embracing the video game culture and what it means, and understanding what it means to regulate in a space that actually produces so many positive results.
All right, so what can we all do as it pertains to, thinking about screen time, getting ready for E3? What is it that you want people to take away from this conversation that we had today?
I think first and foremost, visit our website, follow us on Twitter, and get the information so that you can use the information in a positive way when you're having conversations. Because one or two small facts actually make a huge impact in these conversations. And we talk to people in all walks of life. If you're talking to a state legislator from Indiana, he may not know all about the innovation tools, but if you can connect it to a couple things that make sense, it changes the conversation and their perception of how they want to regulate. I think beyond that, it's really about engaging in what companies do for innovation, for immigration, for trade, like being able to proselytize a little bit about some of the positives that we do, and then sharing the positive stories. Every once in a while, I'll open up an industry rag, and they talk about this amazingly positive thing, and someone will email me and say, we need more stories like this. So it's really encouraging more of those positive stories so that we're sharing that information and getting it out. And then I think in terms of screen time, we've got the most robust parental controls of any industry, so let's use those and let's tell people about what it means to use those, because you can limit spending, time, access to certain games, you can limit internet, you can do all those things. And so we have an answer for all of the problems that people raise on these topics, and so we ought to be familiar with those and talk about those, because that differentiates us from a lot of other industries.
All right, well, I have one last question, and I think, I don't know if you'll be able to answer it, but you get to see all of this from a very comprehensive standpoint, and you get to see the video game industry as it's rapidly evolving. What do you believe is going to be next? So what are we going to see next in this space? Like, is it going to be like more consoles or more interesting types of games, or like what are we going to see like that isn't being talked about quite yet?
I think the actual thing that we're going to see is the dominance of our industry in a lot of big discussions. People don't realize that we are certainly the most successful of the media industries today, and I think that's worldwide now. I heard that we just surpassed television. So whether you're talking about film, music, and the like, I think if you go to Newzoo, they have a stat about us being larger than television. So that means that we have more of a voice. So I think that's going to be pretty critical. You're going to see more people trying to do more with games. And I think you're going to see more positive outcomes because of that prevalence and that dominance. I mean, the cultural zeitgeist is video games. Like, people may not talk about it all the time, and then you mention it, and everyone has a conversation about video games. So how do we capitalize on the cultural, not just the economic, but the cultural zeitgeist in which we find ourselves? Because every kid wants to be a game maker. Everyone wants to play games. Everyone wants to figure it out. They want to talk about it, be part of it. So that's exciting. Can I ask you one question before we leave?
Me?
Yeah, what are you playing these days?
Oh, wow. Tetris 99 on Nintendo Switch. That's all I have time to play. And sometimes Mario Kart, but for some reason, I'm always getting third place. It's really bad. And when I do have time to sit down, I really like immersive sims. I actually gave a TEDx about it, and that it teaches me critical thinking and problem-solving skills. And gaming is part of my DNA. I've been a lifelong gamer, so I'm always going to be playing something terribly. I'm not a good gamer by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm always playing something interesting.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been a super informative conversation. I learned a lot myself, and I hope that all of you did as well. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll be talking to you more.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.